بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم البشير النذير سيدنا مولانا محمد السراج المنير. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. In this video I will be continuing with my reaction to a part of Dr. Jonathan Brown's appearance on the Thinking Muslim podcast. Link will be in the description. If you haven't seen the previous video, please do so, as I will be building on from there. Though these videos are shaping out to be less of a reaction and more of a springboard to present a counter perspective. The delay between the last video and this video has led me to adding to my notes here and there, so I apologize in advance for the length. I'll try not to go too far over an hour, but no promises. There are some really important and generally unknown hadith issues that I would like to get into and share. Let's see if I can get to them in this part. If not, they'll be in the next one, inshallah, and sooner rather than later. In the previous video, we mainly looked at two statements from a few early scholars that Dr. Brown was supporting, and by which he teaches his students that the Sunnah is more powerful than the Qur'an. The first of which was that the Qur'an does not rule over the Sunnah, but rather the Sunnah rules over the Qur'an. And the second of which was that the Qur'an needs the Sunnah more than the Sunnah needs the Qur'an. Most of the last video was spent just looking and talking about these two statements, but we didn't get to hear Dr. Brown's own justifications yet, and that is where this video will continue from. So let's listen to Dr. Brown try to make this make sense for us.
Right. And you also see sayings like this. The Quran needs the Sunnah more than the Sunnah needs the Quran. Yeah, I tell this to students, they're like, what is this? They're like throwing their papers up in the air, like, astaghfirullah, what are you talking about? I say, students, relax. Look, there's no debate ontologically, from the perspective of like being. The Quran is obviously prior to and superior to the Sunnah of the Prophet. Like the Quran is the word of God.
Yes.
The Sunnah of the Prophet is the word and the actions of a human being. Even if it's an inspired human being, it's still a human being, right?
Yeah.
If it weren't for the Quran, if it weren't for the revelation, there would be no prophecy, right? So, prophecy is a product of God intervening in history. So if it weren't for that divine intervention, you don't have prophecy. So the Quran is sort of ontologically prior to and superior to the Sunnah of the Prophet.
You see now, students? Relax. I'm only saying the Quran isn't as great as you thought it was. It is only as great as you thought it was ontologically. What has any of that got to do with the issue at hand? Ontologically or not is not the issue. From the perspective of being isn't the contention. That isn't why your students were objecting, and it isn't why liberals would object, nor Quranists, nor anyone else who would object. It isn't why Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal used to object. Ontologically has got nothing to do with this issue and has zero relevance. All that is happening here is that he is pacifying by means of rhetoric. Just relax, he says. The Quran is ontologically more powerful. It is completely meaningless for the issue at hand. This says nothing. This explains nothing. And it isn't even always true. They do sometimes make the Sunnah ontologically more powerful than the Quran. We'll get to that later though, inshallah.
But hermeneutically, right? Hermeneutics is the kind of study of interpretation, the study of understanding. Hermeneutically, the Sunnah of the Prophet is more powerful than the Quran, right? And this is actually, it's interesting because I don't like to, kind of dump on Western scholarship, but in the kind of 20th century, a group of Western literary scholars realized that the real power in a text lies not in the author but in the interpreter. Which this is Muslims understood this, at the very beginning of the Islamic tradition, right? Which is the interpreter has the power.
Now this is really the meat of what he says. This is this idea of the interpreter having the power. And just to let you know, we are going to spend a lot of time on it. If the video gets too long, then I will do the next parts in separate videos, because there really is just so much that needs to be said about this statement within the context of this discussion. Like I said previously, I want these videos to set the groundwork and be reference points for certain things in the future, inshallah. Firstly, what he's reporting that this group of Western literary scholars realized, and which apparently Muslims knew from the beginning, is simply not true. Certainly not as a given in the way that he presents it as a blanket statement. It is a Western idea, just as he says, and it isn't universally accepted. But I don't want to talk about that right now. What I want to say is that it is certainly not true with respect to the Qur'an. So let's think carefully about what he is actually saying here. He is basically saying that the real power of a text, in this case the Qur'an, isn't in the author, in this case God, but rather in the interpreter, in this case the Prophet, right? So ironically, he is taking foreign Western ideas and applying them to not just Islam, but to God's revelation. Yes, he has this throwaway line that Muslims realized this at the beginning. Believe me, this is just that preacher mentality talk of, Muslims knew X, Y, and Z 1,400 years ago. It isn't true any more than it is true for the Christian tradition. Everyone always understood that interpretation is important. Nothing new in that. What he is talking about is a very modern Western idea, born of Western relativism, that all interpretations are valid and therefore can be equally powerful. But again, what does that statement even mean anyway? That the real power of a text, that statement, that part, it depends entirely on what you mean by that. Because for one thing, there will always be limitations to interpretation imposed by a text itself. There are logical limits which are part of any text. Can an interpreter overpower those limits? Go beyond them? Sure. If you get into relativism and revisionism and absurdities, and then have the philosophy that all interpretations are all just as valid, like that, someone could interpret the Qur'an as promoting polytheism. He can say that Shaitan was the true servant of God, who passed the test by being the only one who would not bow to Adam. Such was his devotion to God, one could say. That he had real tawheed, while the angels had less devotion to God than he did, which is why they bowed to Adam, but he didn't. Is that real power in the interpreter? No. The text ultimately dictates. Working against the text cannot be thought of as interpretation unless you rebrand that term. But from a faith perspective, is the Qur'an just like any other text in this case? Nothing unique about it? He is saying that the real power lies in the interpreter, not the author. What? Even if the author is God. Even if that statement were generally true, if anything can transcend it, shouldn't it be the Qur'an? Why are you equating the Qur'an to other texts and God to other authors? Taking a general realization of some Western literary scholars from the 20th century world of relativism, and who look at all texts as written by men, who don't believe in nor accept the reality of divine revelation, and thus form that conclusion of relativism. Why are you taking that and applying it to the book authored by God? That the real power of the book of God is not in the author? It isn't in the text, really? Rather, this dhikr God revealed is a mighty book. It says, إِنَّهُ لَكِتَابٌ عَزِيز إِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِالذِّكْرِ لَمَّا جَاءَهُمْ وَإِنَّهُ لَكِتَابٌ عَزِيز لَا يَأْتِيهِ الْبَاطِلُ مِنْ بَيْنِ يَدَيْهِ وَلَا مِنْ خَلْفِهِ تَنْزِيلٌ مِنْ حَكِيمٍ حَمِيدٍ. It is a mighty book. Falsehood does not come to it, neither from in front of it, nor from behind it. A revelation from the wise appraised. And it is interesting, by the way, that only in front and behind are mentioned. But the questions I want to highlight here are these. Number one, does this sound like the real power is in the interpreter? And number two, does this description fit other books as well, or is it unique? Yes, I know a math book can fit it. Please, nobody be so simplistic, and please stick within the category of the Quran, which is, dhikr. In any case, we are talking about a faith perspective here. Does the Quran also fall into the realization that these Western scholars had, that the real power of a text is not in the text nor its author, but really in the interpreter? That's the question. And were early Muslims really saying that about the Quran? And if some were saying it, will you just accept it as true? Of course, every sect would want it to be true. That's the thing, isn't it? Because then they can say, we have the real interpretation. And so they claim that real power for themselves and remove it from others. Another verse says, إِنَّا جَعَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ وَإِنَّهُ فِي الْكِتَابِ لَدَيْنَا لَعَلِيٌّ حَكِيمٌ. We have made it a pure Qur'an, or an Arabic Qur'an. Both translations, pure and Arabic, apply here, so that you may gain insight. And it is indeed in the mother of the book, in our presence, truly exalted or high, full of wisdom. Does that sound like the real power is in the interpreter? And then there's the famous verse in Surah الزمر. الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم إلى ذكر الله ذلك هدى الله يهدي به من يشاء ومن يضلل الله فما له من هاد. God has sent down the best or most beautiful discourse, literally the best hadith, a book, its parts resembling each other, often repeating. The skins of those who are in awe of their Lord shiver because of it. Then their skins and hearts become soft towards the remembrance of God. That is the guidance of God. He guides with whom He wills. And whoever God leads astray or leaves astray, for him there is no guide. Okay, do you hear that? That is God's guidance, the direct result of the revelation itself. That is the power of guidance. In this verse, where is the space to insert that the real power is in the interpreter, not the author? Where are you going to put that? Where will you put that in, Dr. Brown? You can't, because the text itself has locked you out, as was said in the previous verse. Falsehood cannot approach it. So where's the real power, Dr. Brown? Not in the text, you say, not in the author. And what power are you even talking about? What power? Power for what? Because the only power we are really interested in with respect to the Qur'an, and the only power we should be interested in terms of religion, is the power of guidance. Will you honestly say that the real power for that isn't in the Qur'an? If that is what you think, then you really should question whether what you have found is even guidance at all in God's sight. Furthermore, the Qur'anic paradigm, in the Qur'anic paradigm, the interpreter doesn't have any power. Okay, the interpreter either has knowledge or a disease in their hearts. While the real power is in the muhkamat, which are not influenced by interpretation. And thus we have that famous verse in the beginning of Surah Al-Imran. Right? It says, Allahu alladhi anzala alayka al-kitab minhu ayatun muhkamatun hunna ummul kitab wa ukhra mutashabihat فأما الذين في قلوبهم زيغ فيتبعون ما تشابه منه ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله والراسخون في العلم يقولون آمنا به كل من عند ربنا وما يذكر إلا أولو الألباب. It is He who has sent down the scripture or prescription upon you. Of it are verses which are categorical, categorical muhkamat, or precise, fundamental. And these are the mother or foundation of the scripture, Ummul Kitab. And others which are open, mutashabihat, allegorical, ambiguous, unspecific. The Arabic word is mutashabihat. As for those in whose hearts is a disease, they follow behind what is open of it, seeking fitna and seeking its interpretation, seeking to interpret it. Though none knows its interpretation except God, and the firm in knowledge say, we have faith in it, it is all from our Lord, and none truly take heed but those of real understanding. There is a lot that can be looked at in this verse, but for our purposes, the most important one is that the real power of the Quran at its fundamental and crucial level is in its muhkamat, which don't need interpretation. Not in the interpreters. The real power of the text isn't with them. The real power of the text is open to everyone. Okay, the Quran is in fact warning about interpreters and the perversions that could be in their hearts, which makes them seek out the mutashabihat above and beyond and in favor of the muhkamat, and thus seeking fitna for themselves and others rather than joining with others in the muhkamat and being united by the book. Okay, united by Ummul Kitab. Okay, the muhkamat don't require interpretation, and the people of knowledge make them central. As for the mutashabihat, the Sunnah doesn't even interpret them anyway. The seeking of interpretation, ابتغاء الفتنة, ابتغاء تأويلي, you see around you being done by the sects through their specific versions of the Sunnah is exactly the kind of fitna and discord this verse is talking about. Instead of being united by the book and its muhkamat that require no interpretation, they all seek out the interpretation by their disunited Sunnah and thus are really seeking out fitna and discord. And that interpretation isn't even done using the Sunnah or Hadiths, to be honest. It is just their sectarian interpretations in favor of themselves. And this is all, propelled by the diseases in their hearts, the disease which is basically sectarianism and tribalism. But okay, let's take a step back and say the interpreter has power. We all know interpretation is important. Even that verse can be read as none knows their interpretation except God and those firm in knowledge who say, etc., etc. We have faith in all of it, right to the end of the verse. So let's say the interpreter has the power, or has power. He wants to say the interpreter is the Prophet. But the major problem is that the Prophet did not interpret the Quran at all, neither the muhkamat nor the mutashabihat. Okay, that's right, the Prophet did not interpret the Quran, nor are there any hadiths of the Prophet interpreting verses of the Quran. Nor can his Sunnah interpret the Quran. We'll come back to that again and again. Such hadiths do not exist, period. So the Prophet is not the interpreter of the Quran. Why? Because if any are supposed to be the interpreters of the Quran, then it is us. Right? God has commanded us directly to ponder and take lessons from and thus interpret the Quran ourselves. He's inviting us to do it, to do that himself, offering the Quran for us to interpret, saying that he has made the Quran blessed, fruitful, mubarak, full of barakah, and easy to learn from. And he has actually blamed those who don't interpret the Quran themselves, asking rhetorically, what's wrong with their hearts? Do they have locks on them? All of that is directed straight towards us, not to the Prophet. So if the interpreter has power, then we are the interpreters. That is what God is calling upon us to be, asking us to be. That's what he intended. One verse goes, كتاب أنزلناه إليك مبارك ليدبروا آياته وليتذكر أولو الألباب. A book blessed and fruitful, Mubarak, that we have sent down to you so that they may ponder its verses and so that the people of understanding can receive admonition and learning. Note the change from we sent it to you, إليك, so that they may ponder it. لِيَدَّبَّرُوا آيَاتِهِ, so that they may ponder its signs. And then it is the people of inner cause, ulul albab, who will gain admonition, who will learn. That is how it's supposed to be. Ulul albab don't need the Prophet or anyone else to learn from the Quran. We're sent down to him so that we may ponder and interpret, not sent down to him so that he can interpret it for us, which is why he didn't. Had he interpreted it for us, then his interpretation would have stopped all thought and cut off all discussion. It would have stopped us from pondering and interpreting it ourselves as God expressly wants. So the Prophet did not get in the way of that divine will. And so he was never ever seen sat down in a gathering interpreting the Quran nor explaining the Quran to anyone. That did not happen. Over 6,000 verses. Where are all the narrations of the Prophet's interpretations of them? Non-existent. They don't exist. We are invited to ponder and interpret, and we are explicitly told that taking from it understanding and dhikr, admonition and lessons has been made very, very easy. وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. We have deliberately made the Quran easy for reminders, for learning. So is there anyone who will learn from it? This is a call out to anyone and everyone from God himself. Is there anyone out there who will read the Quran, learn from it, interpret it for themselves and receive lessons and guidance? Anyone? Anyone at all? Come on. We've made it easy. You can almost say this verse is pleading, and it's repeated 4 times in the same surah. It is never that the Prophet should interpret it for us. We are being called upon directly. And those who can't, how are they described? It says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Will they not ponder the Qur'an, or is it that upon their hearts are their own locks? What's wrong with them? Why can't they ponder the Qur'an? Why do they need someone else to ponder and interpret the Qur'an for them? The only possible reason, given that the Qur'an has been made so easy, is that they have locks on their hearts. And among those locks, I will tell you now, is to think that you need the Sunnah to interpret the Qur'an, or to think that the Sunnah is more powerful than the Qur'an, or to lock yourself into what scholars said 1,300 years ago due to severely misplaced reverence which itself is another lock, locks upon locks that you place yourself upon your own heart. So I've said it before and I will say it again, if you cannot find all the guidance you need in the Qur'an, then you have no one to blame but yourself. And most of us have been there, by the way, because that's what we were fed from an early age, or from when we first converted, like Dr. Brown here. As soon as we become religiously aware, the tradition gives us locks to put on our own hearts that lock us out of the Qur'an. But a point comes where you can't blame the tradition, nor your upbringing, nor those at whose hands you converted. The question on Judgment Day will not be was not the Sunnah's interpretation of the Qur'an told to you. The question will be, أَلَمْ تَكُنْ آيَاتِي تُتْلَى عَلَيْكُمْ. أَلَمْ تَكُنْ آيَاتِي تُتْلَى عَلَيْكُمْ فَكُنْتُمْ بِهَا تُكَذِّبُونَ. Were not my verses recited to you and you used to give them the lie? You used to reject them? And another verse, it goes, قَدْ كَانَتْ آيَاتِي تُتْلَى عَلَيْكُمْ فَكُنْتُمْ عَلَىٰ عَقَابِكُمْ تَنْكِصُونَ. If I remember. Truly my verses were recited to you, but you used to turn back away from them on your heels. There's a point where the responsibility is all yours, because no one can really lock your heart without you allowing it. And then sometimes you add more locks of your own, or clamp down on the ones you already have even more, for whatever reason. Maybe because you are used to them, or because you find them comforting, or maybe just as a reaction to those pointing them out to you. You'd prefer turning away from those who point them out to you. Even if it means turning away from the verses, or at least being neglectful of them. Rather than accepting the relevance of those verses if such are the people who point them out to you. Yet ironically, you will accept statements that completely belittle the Qur'an, as long as it comes from the right people, from the revered people, from your Salaf, from your forefathers in religion. Anyway, I digress. The point is that even if the real power lies in the interpreter, in the case of the Qur'an, the interpreter is not, nor did God ever intend for it to be the Prophet. And yes, I am aware of verses like 1644, verse 44 of Surah An-Nahl, or the bees. I'll get to talking about that abused verse later, or some other time, because I think he does mention it. But just in case I don't, or there is a long delay between this and the next video, the basic gist is just to look at the previous verse, or even the start of that same verse itself, which often has the beginning cut out of it, as part of its abuse, unfortunately. Just look at the start of the verse and look at the previous verse. That's all it takes. The Prophet is supposed to use the dhikr to clarify to the rest of mankind what had previously been revealed to them and taught to them by those previous messengers, right? The ones mentioned in the previous verse, whose teachings and message got modeled up. Hence, he was to use the clear dhikr given to him to clarify to the rest of mankind what had become modeled for them. Simple as that. Read both verses together, and you should see it as obvious once it has been pointed out. And another verse, or other verses, even in the same surah, confirm that reading. But let's get back to a few more points regarding Dr. Brown's argument of hermeneutics. Firstly, if that is the case, i.e. that the Sunnah of the Prophet is hermeneutically more powerful than the Qur'an, then hermeneutically the understanding of the Salaf and the scholars is itself more powerful than the Sunnah of the Prophet, right? You can't say the Sunnah is hermeneutically more powerful than the Qur'an without saying that those who interpreted the Sunnah are not also more powerful than the Sunnah. Because that Sunnah also needs to be interpreted and understood. That's why there are books explaining and interpreting Hadiths. And even prior to that, there is a selection process that decides what is Sunnah in the first place, which is even more powerful because it decides from the massive corpus that is narrated and attributed and from the handed down practices what is actually Sunnah in the first place and what is not, what is true Hadith and what is false, what is lived Sunnah and what is just culture. Okay, and scholars and sects differ on that. So one scholar insists something is Sunnah and the other says no, it isn't. And even if they agree on a text, they may disagree on its interpretation. They may interpret it completely differently. We mentioned this in part 1, right? The scholars and Hadith critics rule over the Sunnah in the end. Okay, secondly, who says the Sunnah is hermeneutically more powerful anyway? No, it isn't. Rather, the Qur'an is actually hermeneutically more powerful in interpreting for us and helping us to understand the actions of the Prophet and his Sunnah. We can understand him and his Sunnah through the Qur'an. What did Aisha say when she was asked what the Prophet was like? Right? She said he was like a walking Qur'an. Right? If you want to know and understand him, look at the Qur'an. Look at what it teaches and what it says and what it praises and what it discourages. He was like that. His Sunnah was to follow that. This isn't a chicken and egg situation. We know what came first, the Qur'an. Okay, we even measure him against it. If he were to go astray or make mistakes, and he did make mistakes, it is only against what was revealed to him, the Qur'an, that we can hermeneutically understand that he was wrong. And there's a verse, قُلْ إِنْ ضَلَلْتُ فَإِنَّمَا أَضِلُّ عَلَى نَفْسِي وَإِنْ اهْتَدَيْتُ فَبِمَا يُوحِي إِلَيَّ رَبِّي إِنَّهُ سَمِيعٌ قَرِيبٌ. Say, if I go astray, then I only go astray because of myself. And if I am guided, then it is by what my Lord has revealed to me. Truly he is hearing near. This can be put another way. If I go astray, it will be because of my Sunnah. If I am guided, then it will be by what my Lord has revealed. Okay, the Quran is the hermeneutic criterion even against the Prophet himself in understanding whether he is guided or astray. We interpret his actions against the Quran. And that is exactly the point. If anything, we should interpret the Sunnah in accordance with the Quran, not the Quran in accordance with the Sunnah. And we should identify the false and the true Sunnah using the Quran, of course, rather than abrogate Quranic verses in accordance with any Sunnah. How is a Hadith or Sunnah that is abrogating a verse actually explaining it? Explain that to me. How is it its interpreter? It isn't. It's its nullifier. So now in the case of abrogation, even ontologically speaking, that Sunnah is wiping out the Quran. It has even more ontological being than the Quran because the imperatives of those verses are wiped out by the being and presence of that Sunnah. Okay? Therefore, in such cases of abrogation, the Sunnah is actually ontologically more powerful than the Quran as well because its presence nullifies it, right? When you take the Quran as hermeneutically more powerful than the Sunnah, then you will see that the Quran actually documents things which were part of the Prophet's Sunnah but have not survived, and also corrects a lot of things in the Sunnah and Seerah, his biography, a lot more than is generally understood. Our understanding of the Seerah changes if we use the Quran hermeneutically. Our interpretation of what is reported of the Prophet doing or saying and why, and what was happening around him, a lot of that changes. It would all be understood correctly if we looked at them through the lens of the Quran. Okay. Thirdly, when you talk of more powerful in hermeneutics, i.e. understanding and interpretation, then as I said earlier, most of the Quran, the vast majority, has not been and actually cannot be interpreted by neither the Sunnah of the Prophet nor Hadiths from the Prophet. There are virtually no Hadiths of the Prophet explaining anything in the Quran. Just open up the Quran at any page and tell me just how many verses the Sunnah or Hadiths have explained or interpreted for you. It just isn't true. So even if the Sunnah was hermeneutically more powerful than the Quran, that power has been wasted because that hermeneutics was not done. It wasn't done. It doesn't exist and never existed. Okay. The last point I want to say here is that the truth of the matter is in fact the complete opposite. The narrated hadiths, the very few which actually mention a verse of the Quran, in actual fact cover up the clear meanings of the Quran. Rather than provide interpretation and information and understanding, they often obfuscate, mislead, belittle, confuse, downplay, or exaggerate. They take an already clear text and cover it up with diversions and misinformation. Hadiths are forced into verses where they don't fit and where they don't belong, much more often than not. The marriage and consummation of prepubescent girls being a clear example. What has the Sunnah clarified and interpreted there? Are there any hadiths of the Prophet explaining that verse? From the verse itself, no one would say that consummation with prepubescent girls is allowed because it is clearly talking about women. And the whole point of a waiting period is to check for pregnancy, which is why in another verse, if marriage isn't consummated, then there is no waiting period at all. But the hadiths are forcefully shoved into that verse and distort it, right? Another example is Surah Al-Fatiha, where we pray to not be of al-maghdubi alayhim, those upon whom is anger, nor ad-dallin, right, those who are astray. What does the hadith do? It tells us that the maghdubi alayhim are the Jews and the dallin are the Christians. And it says, who else? Faman, right? The hadith says, who else? The hadith asks rhetorically, who else but them? Faman. Well, I'll tell you who else. Everyone whom God has said upon them is anger in the Quran. Like the deliberate murderer, right? Upon them is anger. Those who run away during a battle. Those who fully open themselves to kufr after iman. Those who overstep the bounds. The woman who commits zina and then makes the fifth oath against herself, right? Those who argue with God. All those are groups upon whom is ghadab, upon whom is anger. But Muslims now recite the Fatiha 17 times a day, and if they even think about it, they just think the maghdubi alayhim are the Jews. I recently was speaking to an Egyptian who would not hear any of anything else. It didn't matter about other verses that mention ghadab alayhim or maghdubi alayhim. Okay, for him, the ones in Fatiha are the Jews, and that's it. And the prayer in Fatiha is only asking and warning us to not be like the Jews. That's it. But my friend, I say, among the Jews are also muttaqeen and righteous, right? He's like, no, they're all maghdubi alayhim. The hadith says so, and that's it. Okay, that's that. And the same goes for the dallin, right? Those who are astray. Among the dallin, Surah Al-Fatiha should be included everyone God has mentioned in the Quran as dallin, as astray, or in dalal, or in dalalin mubin. It's not just the Christians, because even that isn't true for all of them. Okay, if it weren't for this hadith, Muslims would actually think about this logically. Okay, they would look into the Quran to find, who are maghdubi alayhim and who are dallin, or without even looking, just naturally as they read through the Quran, when they come across verses regarding God's anger upon certain people and for certain actions, they would link it. They would link those things to Fatiha. And when they came across verses about being astray, they would link them to Fatiha as well. But this hadith is a barrier to that. Okay, it has stunted them and blinded them and given them a falsehood to hold on to and false pride, right? One which obfuscates the verse and the rest of the Quran. This is why the Prophet did not explain the Quran. And how we know even this hadith is false and nonsense. Okay, it doesn't explain nor interpret nor give any understanding of maghdubi alayhim nor dallin. All it does is misdirect by pinning the whole thing onto the Jews and the Christians to make Muslims feel good that they are not like them. Who else? The hadith says, come on, give me a break, as if the Prophet didn't know who else, right? He did know. So again, let me repeat this because it is important and so obvious once it is pointed out to you and you see it. Hadiths and narrations, especially those in tafsir books, actually make the Quran less clear and often trivialize it. They don't help with understanding or interpretation. But the opposite is true. The Quran does often help us to interpret and understand incidents in the Prophet's life much more accurately and helps to filter and vet the reported Sunnah. The verses about the marriage of Zainab help us to interpret the hadiths about it, right? The verses about the Battle of Badr help us to understand the situation at Badr, and the presence of hypocrites there. The hadiths tell us that there were no hypocrites in Badr. No, there were hypocrites there. The verses about the captives of Badr help us to understand that no, the Prophet didn't want to take captives. It was the Sahaba who wanted dunya. The Prophet wasn't wrong, and while Umar was right. That isn't the way it is. Okay, using the Quran, we can hermeneutically understand those narrations better. Yet another example is that there was no complete massacre of a Jewish tribe in Medina, because from the Quran it says some you killed and some you took prisoner. Nor were all Jewish tribes exiled from Medina, because in later surahs we see that right up until the end of the Prophet's life, there were Jews living in Medina who used to come to the Prophet for judgment, even though they had the Torah and the Quran, and the Quran would address them directly, right? Where is that in the Seerah and Hadiths? And examples of the Quran filtering the Sunnah are, of course, numerous. For example, there is the Hadith where the Prophet swore by God that he had strongly considered having the adhan for Isha Salah called, and then have someone lead the Salah, and then while the people in the mosque prayed, he would go around with a bunch of thugs, essentially, and burn down the houses of everyone who didn't attend the Salah in the mosque. Dr. Brown actually commented on this hadith once. He said that this hadith just shows the Prophet's way or style of teaching. No, Dr. Brown, no. It absolutely was not the Prophet's sunnah or way of teaching. Okay, how in the world can you even say that, let alone think it, right? Where is that image in the Quran? Is that what a walking teaching the Quran would do? Is that the sunnah interpreting the Quran for you? Is it hermeneutically more powerful than the Quran? No. Okay, instead, the hermeneutics of the Quran about the Prophet tells us that this hadith is absolutely false. As if we needed to be told. The Quran says about the Prophet, وَخْفِضْ جَنَاحَكَ لِمَنِ اتَّبَعَكَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, and lower your wing to those who follow you of the faithful. These followers of yours, be gentle and merciful to them. Okay, lower your wing to them. فَإِنْ عَصَوْكَ فَقُلْ إِنِّي بَرِيءٌ مِّمَّا تَعْمَلُونَ. But if they disobey you, then just say, I am free and innocent of what you do. That's it. Not if they don't obey you, threaten them harshly, tell them that you had strongly considered burning down their homes. This would not cross the Prophet's mind even as something to threaten with. Burn down their homes because they missed a salah in the mosque. Come on, right? In another verse, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَظًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. By mercy from God, you were soft with them, and if you were uncuffed, thuggish, and hard of heart, then they would have dispersed from around you. Right? That's the Sunnah. That was his way of teaching, Dr. Brown. It was, that was his style and way. It was a way that was full of forbearance, patience, gentleness, and mercy. Not this Umayyad hadith that is trying to make sure everyone comes to the mosque so that they can monitor them, spread their pro-ruler propaganda, and keep an eye on anyone they feared would give them trouble. But this is what happens when you make the Sunnah recorded in the time of tyrants and for tyrants more powerful than the Quran. You end up with a Muhammad who was uncouth, thuggish, and hard of heart. And you then find a 21st century Muslim convert scholar who tries to convince us that it was the Prophet's style of teaching to be so. No, then Dr. Brown, why don't you follow that Sunnah, that style of teaching in your own job, in your university teaching position, see how far it gets you. Unbelievable. And even more ridiculous that this explanation comes from an educator, right? Someone who has students and works in education, or really not so unbelievable. It just shows how religious dogmatism can overwhelm even daily lived common sense. Even someone so obviously decent in character as Dr. Brown here. But this is where you get to when you are naive and accept nonsense like the Sunnah is hermeneutically more powerful than the Quran. Just because you think early Muslims have it right and because you worship that tradition and bend over backwards trying to justify it, right? Style of teaching, he says about the hadith. No, not the style of teaching. So no, the Quran interprets the hadith for us and shows it to be a lie. And if we use the Quran to understand and interpret early history, and how as you get to the later and later surahs, it is obvious that the number of hypocrites are increasing, and how in the last surah revealed, which corresponds to the last year of the Prophet's life, when apparently everyone was Muslim, there were those who raced each other in kufr, and who would divert the meanings of words and speech after their placement. When you use the Quran to understand that and more, you'll be able to understand why such a lie was made and propagated and even came to be accepted as sahih. To be fair though, because Dr. Brown is stuck with this hadith, right? Since his Ahlul Hadith have saddled him with it, by declaring it sahih. To be fair, he himself is actually using the Quran to hermeneutically give, that ridiculous interpretation, basically, that it was just his style of teaching. If he were to seriously consider this hadith to be a record of the Sunnah, of his style of teaching, of the Prophet's style of teaching, then use that to actually interpret the Quran, he would have to reinterpret all of those verses, right? But he doesn't do that, does he? Right? So where has that disappeared to? That the Sunnah is more powerful than the Quran, right? It's gone. But coming back once again to that earlier point, which I will, even repeat again later, the Sunnah just does not interpret the Quran. That is one of the biggest false claims repeated by both laymen and scholars, which passes around freely and unopposed because no one thinks about it, nor thinks to investigate it. Okay, there are almost zero hadiths of the Prophet interpreting the Quran. Why? Because the Prophet did not sit around teaching the interpretation of the Quran. Look through any tafsir book. Okay, it is not the Prophet interpreting anything. It is all people like Mujahid, Ikrimah, Qatada, Ibn Abbas, Ata ibn Abi Rabah, etc., etc. These are the people you find in tafsirs interpreting the Quran. And in the background are Ahlul Kitab and their Israeliyat, right? And especially Ka'b al-Ahbar in particular. And recall the Quran warns us about Ahlul Kitab, it warns us about them and warns us about their alliance with Quraysh. Yet Quraysh came to rule, and half of our tafsir is from Ka'b al-Ahbar and Ahlul Kitab. What happened there? Point is, the tafsir in our tafsir books is never the Prophet, because he never did it. Look through the books of tafsir and look through the hadith books too. Hadiths of the Prophet interpreting the Quran are not there. See my playlist on this channel called The Prophet Did Not Explain the Quran, where I do a quick survey of the chapters of tafsir in Bukhari and Muslim. The other collections are no better, by the way. Look through Suyuti's tafsir, which is a tafsir made up of only narrations. It is all contradictory reports from other than the Prophet. And the ones from the Prophet interpret nothing. They are just atomized hadiths, same as any other hadiths. Nothing about them says tafsir or interpretation of the Quran. And even when there is an occasional narration from the Prophet himself, it is usually irrelevant. It is just lumped in under a verse for some superficial reason, like that it contains the same word used in the verse. That's it. But you will find it actually neither explains nor interprets anything in the verse, nor even references the verse in question. You would never ever conclude from the narration that the Prophet is trying to explain the verse in question, which the Mufassir has put the hadith under. You can't make that link. And in the rarest of rarest occasions where you could make an argument that there is a narration where the Prophet is actually clarifying or explaining or interpreting something, you find that it is never him just offering up interpretations without being asked. It is him answering questions, most of which are not very good questions at that. Or let me be more blunt, they are often, stupid, thoughtless questions that the intelligent and thoughtful wouldn't need to ask. Whenever the Sahaba had some actual pertinent, real questions, they were answered by the Quran itself, just as God Himself promised. It was verses of the Quran that were revealed and which answered them. That's why there are all those verses which start with, they ask you, يَسْأَلُونَكَ. It is one of the reasons why the Quran was not all revealed in one go, so that God Himself would explain and interpret important things that came up. The verse says, وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَوْلَا نُزِّلَ عَلَيْهِ الْقُرْآنِ جُمْلَةً وَاحِدَةً. كذلك لنثبت به فؤادك ورتلناه ترتيلا. And the ungrateful say, if only the Quran was sent down to him all in one go. But thus it was not, so that we may strengthen and make firm with it your mind, and we have rehearsed it, or arranged it to you in slow, well-arranged stages or gradually. ولا يأتونك بمثل إلا جئناك بالحق وأحسن تفسيرا. And so that they do not come to you of any similitude, any argument, any question, except that it is we who will bring to you the truth of it and its best explanation or interpretation. Right? Look, if the Prophet thought that the Quran needed explanation and interpretation, that we, his ummah, needed it, then the Prophet was more concerned about this ummah than anyone else, and more concerned about the Quran than anyone else. The Quran describes him as harisun alaykum, deeply concerned about us. He worried about us greatly and worried for us. لقد جاءكم رسول من أنفسكم عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم. A messenger has come to you from yourselves. It is really grievous and heavy upon him that you should suffer or overburden yourselves. Deeply concerned over you he is. حريص عليكم. Towards the faithful he is extremely kind and merciful. If he thought or knew or even suspected that the Quran needed his Sunnah more than his Sunnah needed the Quran, or if he thought that his job was to interpret the Quran for the Ummah, then he would not have left a single verse of the Quran without having interpreted it himself and explained it to crowds of people, crowds. And furthermore, he would have had that interpretation and explanation written down himself and circulated, just as he had the Quran written down and circulated. Since the Quran needed it so badly. Crowds of people, crowds. But that is not the case at all. It did not happen. You look through all the narrations from Sahih to Da'if, and you do not find the Prophet explaining or interpreting any verses of the Quran. And let's not hide behind the ridiculous excuse that he didn't want to have the Hadiths and the Quran mixed up, that he didn't want his interpretation of the Quran and the Quran mixed up, as if that was an insurmountable obstacle that couldn't be solved, and as if the Quran is in any way similar to the Hadiths or the Sunnah in the first place. No, he didn't explain or interpret the Quran because he knew it wasn't his job to explain or interpret the Quran, period. He did not see the Quran as being unclear or not enough the way most sects do now, so as to require explanation or clarification or interpretation. He didn't see the Quran as deficient without his Sunnah. He didn't see the Quran as incomplete without his Sunnah. He didn't see the Quran as impotent without his Sunnah. None of that would have ever crossed his mind. Do you have any idea how much reverence he had before God and how much adab he had before him? Such things would never have crossed his mind. He knew that it was closer to his responsibility to not explain or interpret the Quran for us, and to not get in God's way, to not get in between us and the Quran, because his explanation and his interpretation would become a barrier between us and the Quran, especially after he died. He knew that the Quran was bigger than he was, and that his interpretation of it would ultimately be confining, especially to those thousands of years in the future and in completely different circumstances. So in fact, he was supposed to not interpret it and to not get in the way of our contemplation and interpretation of it, which is why he didn't. Otherwise, if you disagree, give me another explanation as to why we don't have an abundance of hadiths from him explaining verses of the Quran. And yes, to repeat, I am aware of the verses that are brought up to say that he was tasked with explaining the Quran. But, the fact remains that he did not do it. He didn't do it. So either he disobeyed that directive, or your understanding of those verses is just plain wrong. Simple as that. Those verses are just saying that he, as the last messenger to all of mankind, was to use the clear dhikr, which is the last revelation to mankind, to clarify to all of mankind what had previously been revealed to them but had become muddled. He was to clarify that by means of the Quran, not clarify the clear Quran which God himself has made clear, as if he could make more clear that which God himself made clear and described as clear. That would be poor adab and presumptuousness on his part, and he was not like that before God. Though in all honesty, the correct word is mubin, and it shouldn't be used as a synonym of clear, because that just isn't accurate, But hey, one battle at a time. Everything can't be corrected in one go, since it's all interconnected in some way. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to get into before we get back to the video, if we have time, is that even from a hadith perspective, the whole starting point is wrong anyway. There is no indication that the Prophet intended for his Sunnah to interpret the Qur'an after his death, even if we admit that the corpus of narrations and hadiths does actually interpret the Qur'an, which, let me repeat again, it does not. The Prophet did not say to follow his Sunnah after he died, nor to use his Sunnah to interpret the Qur'an into our lives after him for all of the next coming centuries and millennia. The hadith that the Prophet said, I am leaving behind you two things that if you hold on to, you will never go astray, the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of his Prophet. The truth about that hadith is that it is an outright lie and fabrication. Or if you're a Sunni and can't handle that, then it is certainly weak, because it is by all objective metrics. It is not Sahih. It isn't in Bukhari or Muslim or Nisa'i or Abu Dawood or Tirmidhi or Ibn Majah. It isn't in those main 6 collections of Sunni hadiths, nor is it even in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, because all of them knew full well that it was not authentic at all, not by any stretch. Those collections, other than Bukhari and Muslim, contain many reports that are weak, yet they are included. This narration, however, has so little backing that none of them include it. It is mentioned by Imam Malik in his Muwatta, but just as something that reached him, balaghahu, right, without a chain of transmission, because even he, the top hadith scholar and narrator and living all his life in Medina, where 10,000 Sahaba lived and died, and him being only 2 generations away from them, and him seeing their students and children and grandchildren daily, even he still couldn't find a single good chain of narrators for this forgery. And make no mistake, it is a forgery. But why would anyone forge such a hadith, you might ask? Well, simple, to take people away from the true and correct version of this hadith, the version which is in fact found in major Sunni collections and other collections, and is considered mass transmitted and is also accepted as authentic by every major sect of Islam, and which Imam Malik undoubtedly knew about but would not include in his Muwatta. And why would Imam Malik include the forgery which doesn't have a chain, but not the known mass-transmitted Sahih version? Simple, political pressure and sectarian influences. And though Dr. Brown will later talk in that ridiculous, naive way that scholars, even those who were persecuted, did not bow to political pressure and tyrants, and were not swayed by political atmosphere at all in matters of importance, and that is simply not true. It is an obvious fact that many did to a greater or lesser extent, knowingly or unknowingly. So for example, as Al-Dhahabi records, Imam Malik couldn't narrate from Ja'far al-Sadiq until Banu Umayyah were gone. He narrates from one of Malik's students that Malik did not narrate from Ja'far al-Sadiq, who was the greatest scholar of his generation, but also the 6th Imam for the Shia, one of the descendants of Ali through Al-Hussein. Malik could not narrate anything from him until Banu Abbas came to power. لم يروي مالك عن جعفر حتى ظهر أمر بني العباس. Right, that was narrated by Al-Dardawardi. He couldn't, it was dangerous. Just narrating a hadith of the Prophet through Ja'far al-Sadiq, one of the descendants of Ali and Ahlul Bayt, that could get you into trouble. Never mind narrating a hadith from Ali himself, which is why the Muwatta has practically nothing from Ali. And remember also how Imam Shafi'i was almost killed by the Umayyads for his suspicion of being pro-Alid. Plus Imam Malik himself had an Umayyad inclination, as Abu Zuhra says about him, Naz'a Umayyah. It was the environment he grew up in, and his main teacher was Nafi', who was in the Umayyad armies and a Nasibi. And his teacher was Ibn Umar, who was a Sahabi who insisted on the bay'ah to Yazid when everyone else in Medina revolted against that tyrant. Political pressure and a person's own sectarian biases and background and teachers, all of that plays a part. Get rid of this engineered, sanitized, blanket, rosy view of the scholars and imams as objective champions of objective truth who are courageous to a fault. Be realistic. These were very turbulent times, Take a lesson from the behavior of scholars now in the countries where tyrants rule. The tyrants don't need to directly command them. They are like gravity. They have the power and the money, and they pull in the masses and the scholars into their orbit. That's why the Quran warns to not, be inclined to the tyrants. وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارُ وَمَا لَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ مِنْ أَوْلِيَاءَ ثُمَّ لَا تُنصَرُونَ. And do not incline to the tyrants lest the fire touches you. Imam Malik included in this narration is an example of that. In any case, this version of Qur'an and Sunnah is false. It has no sound sanad, no sound chain of transmission, only much later patching to try to give it a full chain by Ahlul Hadith. Whereas the other version is the real version. It is mass transmitted according to their standards. And that real version is so well attested because it was delivered by the Prophet to a huge gathering of people just a few months before the end of his life at the event of Ghadir Khumm, when the Prophet told everyone in a gathering of up to 20,000 people or even 30,000 people that his time was almost up and he was going to die. And he was advising what would keep the Ummah from going astray after him, what they needed to hold on to. What did he say? He didn't say you should hold on to the Qur'an and Sunnah, and he certainly never indicated in any way that his Sunnah was hermeneutically more powerful than the Qur'an. He didn't say any of that which Dr. Brown is promoting. Rather, he said at that great event and in that parting address to hold on to what he termed the two weighty things, the thaqalain. And he said that one of them was much greater and much heavier than the other. And what were those two weighty things? Qur'an and Sunnah? No, they were Qur'an and his itra from his Ahlul Bayt, the close family members from the people of his household who were alive then. And he said that the Qur'an was the greater and heavier and in essence the more powerful of the two. And he emphasized that strongly, that the Qur'an alone was enough. And the only justification for holding on to the smaller, less heavy, less powerful thing, i.e. his Ahlul Bayt, is also given. It is because God himself had informed him that they would not separate from the Qur'an until they died. And historically it is true. Those four never did until the day they died. May God be pleased with them. Let me read the main part of his parting speech at Ghadir, just to be clear. What he said was, يا أيها الناس إنما أنا بشر يوشك أن يأتيني رسول ربي فأجيبه. O people, I am only a mortal, and soon the messenger of my Lord will come and I will respond. I am going to die soon. Right? This is parting advice. So what do you think he is going to say? Hold on to my Sunnah because it came as a qadi over the Qur'an? Hold on to my Sunnah because it is more powerful than the Qur'an? Hold on to my Sunnah because without it you will be misguided and cannot be guided by the Qur'an alone? Is that what he's about to say in this farewell address? Or will he not mention the Sunnah at all? So he says, وَإِنِّي تَارِكٌ فِيكُمَ الثَّقَلَيْنِ مَا إِن تَمَسَّكْتُمْ بِهِ لَن تَضِلُّوا بَعْدِي. And I am leaving behind me among you two weighty things, which if you hold on to, you will never go astray after me. أَحَدُهُمَا أَعْظَمُ مِنَ الْآخَرِ. One of them, these two weighty things, is greater, heavier or bigger in other narrations than the other. And it is the book of Allah, Kitabullah. And note how the false Qur'an and Sunnah version doesn't go out of its way to say that the Qur'an is greater than the Sunnah in any way, let alone ontologically, while the mass transmitted version puts the Qur'an where it should be. The hadith continues, describing the Qur'an, حَبْلٌ مَمْدُودٌ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ الْأَرْضِ طرف بيد الله عز وجل وطرف بأيديكم فيه الهدى والنور. It is a rope extended from the sky to the earth, one end in God's hand and the other in your hands. In it is guidance and light. Now just look at that. Look at how the Prophet speaks of the Qur'an to us, just as the Qur'an does, right? A direct link, a rope between us and God for whoever wants to climb to God, right? لمن شاء اتخذ إلى ربه سبيلا. And as having real guidance and real light with no mention of the Sunnah, right? Just look at the difference. Look at the difference between what we are positive the Prophet said about the Qur'an versus how the sectarian speakers and scholars like Dr. Brown here speak about the Qur'an as something deficient, constantly pushing it down in order to justify their hadiths. See how the Prophet was truly full of the Qur'an? How he honored it, elevated it, considered it to be truly God's book of guidance, how he was smitten by it? While you try to smite us with the deformed Sunnah. من استمسك به وأخذ به كان على الهدى ومن تركه وأخطأه كان على الضلالة. Whoever holds on to it firmly and takes hold of it is upon guidance, and whoever abandons it and misses it is upon misguidance. Simple. What else would you expect from a book of God? It is a Furqan. It is the criterion for guidance and misguidance, truth and falsehood, success and failure. And that doesn't require his sunnah, it only requires holding on to it and taking from it. فَخُذُوا بِكِتَابِ اللَّهِ وَاسْتَمْسِكُوا بِهِ لَن تَضِلُّوا. So take the book of Allah and hold on to it firmly, you will not go astray. Okay, that's what he said. After all that about the Quran, he then mentions the less weighty, less powerful thing, and gives the reason why he mentions it. What is it? وَعِتْرَتِي أَهْلَ بَيْتِي. And the itra of my Ahlul Bayt, i.e. the close ones from the people of my household, closest members. Who are they? Bottom line, Ali, Fatima, Hassan, Hussein. And if you look and know how to read history critically, you will see that they were always with the Quran, always. Hence the speech continues and gives that as the very reason. فإن اللطيف الخبير نبأني أنهما لن يفترقا حتى يرد علي الحوض. For truly the subtle one, the aware one, has informed me that these two, the Quran and my itra, will never separate until they come to me at the hawd, i.e. until they die. And note how this hadith uses the same language that is in the Quran. The subtle one, the aware one, has informed me, which is in Surah Al-Tahrim. Yet even them, though they would always be with the Quran, neither they nor their interpretations are more powerful than the Quran. The Quran still dwarfs them. So even from a hadith standpoint, there is no such thing as the Prophet's Sunnah interpreting the Quran, neither while he was alive, because he didn't, nor after his death, because he never mentioned it with the Quran in his critical parting advice. Let alone did he say anywhere in any hadith that his Sunnah interprets the Quran or is hermeneutically more powerful than the Quran. No, it isn't. It didn't even factor into what he told the Ummah to hold on to after his death. And that which he did tell the Ummah to hold on to after him, other than the Quran, i.e. his itra of Ahlul Bayt, he explicitly said that they were lesser than the Quran, and that he is only telling the Ummah to hold on to them because God himself had informed him that they themselves would hold fast to the Quran and not separate from it until they died. And so after they also died, there would only be the Quran to hold on to. Thus even the living, breathing, walking, talking people whom the Prophet advised the Ummah to hold on to, those who truly lived with him, whom he raised himself in his own home, who imbibed his Sunnah more than anyone else, even they are not heavier nor hermeneutically more powerful than the Quran, let alone the mixed bags of falsehoods and truths that is the narrated Sunnah propagated by each sect hundreds of years later. Now some of you may be asking, why then did the Prophet even mention them? And why did he put Ali in charge after him at that same event of Ghadir Khumm? This is not the time to get into that, but in a nutshell, it is because the most critical time for any new religious community, especially one with enemies and hypocrites among them, and a vast majority of 11th hour converts, the most critical time for a religious community is that transition from when a prophet is alive to after his death. If a community can stay on track through that transition and into the next stage, then there is every chance it will continue intact, and a distorted version of the religion will not rise to the top and be accepted and transmitted generation after generation. And if the community is sidelined at that key stage, then it will subsequently become further and further removed from the truth, and the early mistakes will become traditionally enshrined as part of the religion, thus distorting it, which is exactly what's happened. And attempts at such shifts and perversions in religion, both overt and covert, were already happening while the Prophet was alive, as the last two surahs record, and as evidenced by the 2 assassination attempts on the Prophet's life in the last years of his life when everyone was supposedly a Muslim, because he was in the way of those elements, those countermeasures against the Quran and against prophethood. mostly born of hatred and tribalism, but which nevertheless saw an opportunity in the unity and potential power they had brought about. And if you are Sunni listening to this, ask yourself, how often do you hear the much more authentic version, the Sahih, mass-transmitted version of this hadith? Do you hear it in Friday khutbahs? Do you hear it in circles of knowledge? Do you hear it in lectures? Do you read it often in books? And is any real weight given to it whatsoever within Sunni Islam? Or is the version you are constantly exposed to in all of those occasions the undoubtedly weaker version, which is Qur'an and Sunnah? The one which doesn't say the Qur'an is greater, which I am telling you isn't just weak but a clear forgery created to stand against the authentic version where the Qur'an is portrayed as enough and as a source of true guidance. Which version do you always hear, and why is that? Why do you hardly ever hear the much stronger version while you are inundated with the weaker? Because, like we said, the scholars of the sects are actually more powerful than the Sunnah and Hadiths. They have the power, okay? And they have the power over you, that's why. And for the Shia listening, there is also a part of this hadith that they sideline, because you will find many of them tell you that the Ahlul Bayt are actually weightier or greater than the Qur'an. And they will make the same arguments as Dr. Brown here. That, the Qur'an is of course ontologically prior and superior to Ahlul Bayt, but in terms of hermeneutics and interpretation, the Ahlul Bayt are more powerful. The exact same nonsense, the same BS, especially since they extend that to the descendants of the Itra, making them all infallible, all the way down to the hidden Imam who only speaks to special people who get to meet and talk to him. What I will do in a separate video on this channel is relate and explain the whole event of Ghadir Khumm together with its precursors and aftermath, just so it can be clear, because it shows you two important things. Firstly, the sects don't really follow nor accept hadiths any more than they do the Qur'an, even the most firmly established narrations in existence. They only accept of them what conforms to their sects. If you are Sunni and cannot accept the most authentic hadiths found in your own Sunni collections, but instead allow them to be sidelined due to sectarianism, then what right do you even have to tell anyone else to follow or accept hadiths? As for the Shia, who all certainly claim to accept it, they also only really accept of it the parts they want. They belittle the rest and give preference to the weaker versions. And secondly, taking the event at the Ghadir Khumm and accepting it for what it was opens you up to having a true understanding of this Ummah's early history, what went wrong, and how we got to be as we are now, and how ultimately the Qur'an was sidelined. And as for Qur'anists listening who are wondering why I'm mentioning this hadith when I have so often clearly expressed that no one needs to accept any hadith at all for guidance, then that still holds true. You can completely ignore this hadith just like any other and still find all the guidance you need in the Qur'an. That is actually part of the message of this hadith anyway. No one is under any obligation to trust or accept a single narration. And Ahlul Bayt are no longer with us anyway. But wait for that video and it should become clear why this was needed at the time and as part of the Prophet's parting advice. That is, if the hints I've already given aren't already clear enough. But to get back to the main point and reiterate it, the very premise is wrong from the hadith corpus itself. The Prophet never intended that his sunnah be followed after his death, generation after generation, in order for it to interpret the Qur'an, which it doesn't do anyway. What he intended was for the Ummah to hold on to the Qur'an first and foremost, and secondly to hold on to those whom God had informed him would never part from the Qur'an, the closest members of his family, his Itra, at the head of whom was Ali. If there was any hermeneutics that was needed after him, after the Prophet, it could come from them. And yet they would still not be more powerful than the Qur'an. He intended for the Ummah to take his Itra's lead in following and holding on to the Qur'an only because he, as a Prophet, was informed by God that his Itra would not part from the Qur'an as others would, and he knew they would. He already knew what his primary complaint on Judgment Day would be, just as we do now because it is in the Qur'an. وَقَالَ الرَّسُولُ يَا رَبِّ إِنَّ قَوْمِ اتَّخَذُوا هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ مَحْجُورًا. And the messenger will say, my Lord, my people abandoned this Qur'an for other things, literally did hijrah from it. How did that happen? What caused people to abandon the Qur'an? The enemies of the Prophet, that's what. The next verse says, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَا لِكُلِّ نَبِيٍّ عَدُوًّا مِنَ الْمُجْرِمِينَ وَكَفَى بِرَبِّكَ هَادِيًا وَنَصِيرًا. And thus we have made for every prophet enemies among the criminals, and enough is your Lord as a guide and a helper. What does it mean, and enough is your Lord as guide and helper? Because those who don't abandon the Qur'an will have enough guidance in it and enough help in it against the mujrimeen. And though the common translation of mujrimeen is now criminals, the real mujrimeen in the Qur'an are actually intellectual criminals. They are the falsifiers, the forgerers, the liars, those who create things to counter the truth. Nothing is more criminal than the crimes against the truth itself. But that's another issue. The meaning of ijram in the Quranic vocabulary, it's another issue. The bottom line is that there were enemies to the Prophet and his work among his people who would take people away from the Qur'an. So the Prophet advised his ummah to hold on to the Qur'an and hold on to those whom he knew would never abandon the Qur'an. They were to be the defense against the criminals and their push to abandoning the Qur'an, not his Sunnah. Because ultimately it would be the claims to his Sunnah that the mujrimeen used to have his ummah abandon the Qur'an. Literally do hijrah from it. Hijrah to what? Hijrah from the Qur'an to what they claimed was his Sunnah that interpreted the Qur'an. Anyway, bottom line is this. From the Hadith corpus itself, it is not Qur'an and Sunnah, but the Qur'an and Itra and Ahlul Bayt. Now, of course, Sunnis will especially be vexed by this, which is quite ironic because that is the Hadith. Yet Sunnis have no problem accepting the concept itself, i.e. that the Prophet did not intend for the Ummah to follow his Sunnah alone after him, that there were other Sunnahs to be followed after him too, and in addition to his Sunnah. They don't reject that. They don't reject that concept. Okay, they accept it. They just don't like that it is exclusively Ali and Ahlul Bayt because that would favor the Shia position. Yet they accept the concept. How? Well, because don't Sunnis accept and take as evidence the other counter hadiths, and they are indeed counter hadiths, the ones which say to follow the Sunnah of the rightly guided Caliphs. And these are certainly forged hadiths, obviously meant to mirror his address at Ghadir Khumm, but not in favor of the Qur'an, nor Ahlul Bayt, nor Ali. A version of these counter hadiths goes, I do not know how long I have left among you, so take as examples after me, or take as examples the two after me, and he indicated to Abu Bakr and Umar. So, after me, what? Follow the Qur'an and Sunnah? No. And the Qur'an isn't even mentioned here. It is completely sidelined in this narration, which is one of the many signs that it is a forgery. They have the Prophet giving advice for after he dies, and the Qur'an isn't even mentioned. Instead, it basically says this: while I am alive among you, follow me and my Sunnah. But after I die, follow the way, the Sunnah, the examples, the leadership and guidance of Abu Bakr and Umar. So even the Prophet's Sunnah is sidelined in this narration. After I am dead, follow the two after me. That's what it says. And of course, this is forged after Abu Bakr and Umar had both been the caliphs after him. And don't Sunnis also accept the hadith which talks about how after his death there will be a lot of differing? So what is the way out? Is it the Qur'an? Is it the Qur'an and the Sunnah? Or is the Qur'an once again completely sidelined and not even mentioned? The hadith goes, the Prophet once led us in prayer and then turned to us and admonished us in a powerful way that made eyes weep and hearts tremble. Then someone said, O Messenger of Allah, it is as if this is a parting admonition of one who is going to die. Again, notice how this again is obviously engineered to stand counter to Ghadir Khumm, okay, where the Prophet says explicitly that he will soon die. Anyway, the man continues and says, so what do you enjoin upon us? What do you think the Prophet would reply? Would he reply with something that mentions the Qur'an, or something that doesn't mention the Qur'an at all, but commands complete obedience to rulers and their Sunnah? Well, in this narration accepted by Sunnis, the latter is exactly what he replies. He says, I enjoin upon you to hear and obey even if your ruler is an Abyssinian Habashi slave. For truly those of you who will live after me will see many disputes. So hold on to my Sunnah and the Sunnah of the righteous Caliphs after me. Clench onto it with your molar teeth. What does that mean, after me? It means after I'm dead. After I'm dead, follow the Sunnah of the Caliphs. His Sunnah is not enough apparently. Don't hold on to the Quran with your motif, nor the Quran and the Sunnah with your motif. Instead, hold on to the Sunnahs of the Caliphs with your motif. And it isn't even clear in some versions if his Sunnah is included or not. This is of course a forged hadith for the sake of tyrants. The other versions continue saying how you should always obey the ruler, even if he were an Abyssinian slave, of course. They have to add that bit of racism. That bit of racism has to stay. And you should hold on to that obedience with your motif, because truly the mu'min is like a docile camel. Wherever he is led, he goes. Okay? وَعَلَيْكُمْ بِالطَّاعَةِ وَإِنْ كَانَ عَبْدًا حَبَشِيًا عَضُّوا عَلَيْهَا بِالنَّوَاجِذِ فَإِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُ كَالْجَمَلِ الْأَنِفِ كُلُّ مَا قِيدَ يَنْقَادِ. And I enjoin upon you obedience, even if the ruler is a Habashi slave. Clench onto it with your motif, because truly the mu'min is like a docile camel. Whichever way he is led, he goes. Clearly a false hadith. The beginning of it doesn't even mention the Qur'an at all as something to hold on to after the Prophet. And the end of it has the Prophet ordering total obedience to rulers and describing and praising the believer with exactly what the Qur'an finds blameworthy and says leads to hell, which is to be one of the livestock, to be like the unthinking, unfeeling camel, deaf, dumb and blind, led around by the nose by those in authority. This hadith says that is the true believer. MashaAllah for Ahlul Hadith and their hadiths and their Sunnah, which they gathered and interprets and explains the Qur'an. Okay, in such a convenient way for rulers too. These hadiths are every tyrant's wet dream. These hadiths that talk about following the Sunnah after the Prophet dies. Do you see how this concept of Sunnah after the Prophet is then mixed with the Sunnah of the rulers and then used to tie you to total obedience of the rulers and forget the Qur'an? The Qur'an falls further and further into the background the more you look at these hadiths, while the rulers and the caliphs come more and more into the forefront, which is a clear indication that they are all forged. And the bridge is the concept of the Sunnah, right? So these narrations are all completely at odds with the Qur'an, but because Sunni hadith science has not made the Qur'an the ruler over hadiths, they accept these lies. They accept that the Sunnah of the caliphs after the Prophet must also be followed. But lies always destroy each other. In this case, why should the Sunnah of the Caliphs after the Prophet be held on to so fiercely? Doesn't the Prophet's Sunnah already interpret all of the Quran for us? Isn't that why we need the Prophet's Sunnah? The whole justification for it? To explain and interpret and clarify the Quran? Well then, isn't the Prophet's Sunnah enough? Well, apparently not. So then, is that an admission that the Prophet did not interpret the Quran, but that he left at least some of it for the caliphs to interpret? Or perhaps all of it for the caliphs to reinterpret it afresh after him into their own sunnahs? Is that how it is? Is that how it works? Every caliph sunnah is now the true interpreter of the Quran? Like in the example of the US Constitution versus the Supreme Court that Dr. Brown later gives, that it doesn't matter what the Constitution says, it only matters what the most recent interpretation by the Supreme Court says. That's the example he gives for the Sunnah being hermeneutically more powerful than the Quran. Well then, is the Sunnah of Abu Bakr or Umar, my dear Dr. Brown, also more powerful than the Quran? Did their Sunnahs also come to rule over the Quran rather than the Quran over them? Does the Quran need the Sunnah of Umar more than the Sunnah of Umar needs the Quran? Later in the podcast, his answer is basically yes. That without the Sunnah of Umar regarding the chopping of hands, for example, the Quran would be darkness. That even the Sunnah of Umar is hermeneutically more powerful than the Quran. That's where you end up when you go from the Quran to Quran and Sunnah, to Sunnah is more powerful, to Sunnah includes the Sunnah of the Caliphs. And in history, it actually ended up much worse than that. In history, it ended up with ideas being promoted that the Caliphs of God were themselves superior to and thus more powerful than the messengers of God. The governor of Mecca, Khalid al-Qasri, and Hajjaj bin Yusuf used to say so openly, and no one could object. They would say to the public, to the laymen from the mimbar in Mecca, in their khutbahs, things like, who is better or more honorable in your sight? Your messenger that you send on an errand, or your Khalifa whom you leave to look after your family? And people of course would answer, well, obviously your Khalifa that you leave over your family is more honorable. So they would say, these tyrants would say, in the same way the caliphs of God over his servants are more noble and better in the sight of God than the prophets and messengers. Right? That's what they would say. إن خليفة الرجل في أهله أكرم عليه من رسوله إليهم وكذلك الخلفاء يا أمير المؤمنين أعلى منزلة من المرسلين. And they would push numerous ideas like this, that the caliphs were God's shadow on earth, that if a ruler ruled for just 40 days then they would no longer ever be held accountable by God nor punished, that a day as a caliph is better than so many years of ibadah, etc., etc. These were the sorts of things being pushed. And had they been pushed for long enough until the younger generation grew up hearing them and the older generation had died out with no one pushing back, then they would have been accepted. The complete divine mandate of kings, emperors, and popes has never been a strange concept in the world, especially in the Christian world. And the Umayyad caliphs inherited the Christian lands. Does it end there, this guidance of the Sunnah and Hadiths? No. Next comes this following hadith, which is in Sahih Muslim, which says, "There will be after me leaders who will not be guided by my guidance, nor take their sunnahs from my sunnah, and there will rise up among you men whose hearts are like the hearts of shayateen, like devils, in the bodies of men." I asked, "What should I do, O Messenger of Allah, if I should live till that time?" He replied, "You should hear and obey, even if the ruler whips your back and takes your wealth. Still hear and obey." Yeah, there we go. No, mashallah for the sunnah. So now the sunnah is to obey rulers even if they are shayateen, even if they themselves are not following the Prophet's sunnah nor his guidance, and if they whip your back and take your wealth, you still have to hear and obey. You know, another version of it in Abu Dawood says, "In kana lillahi khalifatan fil ard, fadaraba ala dhahrak, وَأَخَذَ مَالِكَ فَأَطِعْهُ." Right? If God has a caliph on earth at the time and he beats your back and takes your wealth, then obey him. Still obey him. And yeah, of course, right? The hadith says, if God has a caliph, in كَانَ لِلَّهِ خَلِيفَةً, right? Because this hadith is putting it as if the caliphs are chosen by God, right? And set up by God. Now, where has the talk of the sunnah gone? The Quran we lost near the beginning of these narrations, and now we can't even find the Sunnah of the Prophet in his apparent advice for what to do after him. Now it is just raw obedience to rulers, even if they are devils in human form. And of course, such narrations needed to be forged because many of the caliphs were exactly that. They were devils in human form. You know, why am I mentioning all of these false narrations? Because I want you to be able to see something. All of that should show you a clear direction, a clear path and movement, a push away from the Quran and towards the rulers, towards the tyrants. This push away from the Quran with the concept of Sunnah acting as a bridge is exactly what will lead to the Prophet's only complaint on Judgment Day. And it is a push done by the enemies of prophethood. Okay, listen carefully to these next two verses. وقال الرسول يا رب إن قومي اتخذوا هذا القرآن مهجورا. And the messenger will say, "My Lord, my people abandoned this Quran," you know, for other things, did hijrah from it. And what does the next verse say? وكذلك جعلنا لكل نبي عدوا من المجرمين وكفى بربك هاديا ونصيرا. And thus have we made for every prophet enemies among the criminals, among the mujrimeen. And enough is your Lord as a guide and a helper. Okay, what do these mujrimeen, these criminals do? Okay, these intellectual criminals. Because ijram in the Quran is actually about intellectual crimes. You know, these enemies to prophethood. What action does their enmity take? You know, that takes people away from the Quran, that will lead the messenger to say, "My people have abandoned this Quran." Well, listen to this next related verse. وكذلك جعلنا لكل نبي عدوا شياطين الإنس والجن يوحي بعضهم إلى بعض زخرف القول غرورا. And thus have we made for every prophet enemies, shaitans of men and jinn, inspiring in one another embellished words of deceit. You know, for example, the Sunnah is hermeneutically more powerful than the Quran. You know, how about that for embellished words of deceit? Okay. Ontologically, yeah, sure. Ontologically, the Quran is still superior, But where it matters, no, the Sunnah is more powerful and rules over it. Does anything fit this verse more? And how it is linked to the previous verse about doing hijrah from the Qur'an, right, to something else. Come on, will you not wake up? And the concept of Sunnah is at the heart and center of it. Okay, hadiths inspired by these shayateen, these devils among men and jinn. Hadiths, words, embellished words of deceit that even have the Prophet commanding us to obey rulers who don't follow his Sunnah nor his guidance, and whose hearts are like the hearts of devils, shayateen, in the bodies of ins, in the bodies of human beings, who even if they unjustly whip your back and take your wealth, you must still hear and obey. Okay, because this is God's chosen Khalifa on earth. So as bad as it was, it could have gotten even worse too, had not certain revolutions taken place. Maybe the inspired words of the Caliphs of God would have been promoted as being superior to the words revealed to the messengers of God and to the Qur'an. Why not? Some have already accepted that the Sunnah of the Prophet is more powerful than the words of God. Not much further when you have it that the Prophet commanded to hold on to the Sunnahs of the Caliphs after him by our latif. It must mean that their Sunnahs are also more powerful than the Book of Allah. And by the way, people, the Sunnah of each of those Caliphs, including the first 4 Caliphs, was different from the Prophet's Sunnah and different from each other. The Sunnah of Abu Bakr was not the same as the Sunnah of the Prophet, and the Sunnah of Umar was not the same as the Sunnah of Abu Bakr, and Uthman's was not the same as Umar's, and Umar's was not the same as Ali's. And it was only years later that Sunni Islam settled on these 4 as the rightly guided caliphs anyway. Bukhari, for example, and others of Ahlul Hadith excluded Ali and included Muawiyah. And to this day, Sunnis exclude Hassan ibn Ali. Nevertheless, whoever you take as the righteous guided caliphs, their sunnahs were contradictory in many, many places. You can't hold on to all of them with your molar teeth. No one has that many teeth. Nor did each subsequent caliph hold on to the sunnah of the caliphs before him. Umar abandoned many of the sunnahs of Abu Bakr, and Uthman practically abandoned everything of the previous 2, even though he took the bay'ah on the basis that he would follow the sunnahs or the seerah of the 2 sheikhs before him. But he didn't. This was when it had come down to between him and Ali as to who would become the 3rd caliph. Right? Uthman agreed that he would follow the seerah or the sunnah of the previous 2 caliphs before him if he was chosen, whereas Ali said no, that he would instead only follow the Qur'an as best he could. And his stance then, by the way, shows the truth of the Prophet's prophecy at Ghadir Khumm, which we mentioned earlier. That when the time came and all Ali had to do to become the 3rd caliph was to agree to follow the Qur'an and something else, in this case the Sunnah of Abu Bakr and Umar, he refused and said no, rather the Book of Allah and my own ijtihad. Point is, their Sunnahs were different. Some were in line with the Qur'an completely, namely that of the Prophet and that of Ali, and some differed and separated from the Qur'an either on a few issues or many issues. So of course you can't take them all as interpreting the Qur'an, which is exactly why following anyone's sunnah is not mandatory at all, not even the Prophet's sunnah. And don't mistake obedience to the living messenger with following, for the next 10,000 years, claims about the sunnah or the hadiths as collected and described by your sect. They are not the same thing. And in any case, that recorded sunnah, let me repeat again, does not interpret the Qur'an at all. So after the Prophet, it was the Qur'an, the dhikr that we were supposed to follow for guidance into the future throughout the ages up to our present time and beyond. All this is not to belittle the beautiful uswa of the Prophet which is mentioned and recommended in the Qur'an. But sunnah and uswa are not the same thing either. See my perspectives video titled Uswa versus Sunnah for the gist of that. Okay, let me try to summarize this section because I know I've spoken at length. Let me try to put them point by point, right? There's around 8 points. So point 1, as much as you can push on a text through interpretation, there are limits, and the text also pushes back and has its own integrity. The idea that the real power is in the interpreter and not in the author is a Western idea born of 20th century relativism. From the Quranic perspective, there are A, the muhkamat, which require no interpretation, B, the mutashabihat, which the people of knowledge make subordinate to the muhkamat, and C, the focus on the mutashabihat and the interpretation of fitna by those in whose hearts is a disease. No, that isn't where the real power of the text is. And I didn't mention it, but there are also two types of tahrif or distortion of words that the Quran mentions. There's the tahrif of words after their placement and the tahrif of words from their being placed. None of that is the real power of the text. The real power of the text is in the muhkamat, in Kitab. Point 2. The Quran is unique. It is Aziz, mighty, and its author is God. To say the real power isn't in the author, even when the author is God, is not only untrue, it is low faith in God and in the Quran. Point 3. The Prophet did not interpret the Quran. You don't see that anywhere in his seerah nor in his hadiths. There are virtually no hadiths interpreting the Quran, nor even directly addressing verses in order to explain them. Point 4. On the very rare occasions a hadith actually does address a verse, it is either useless for interpretation, tells us nothing or very little, or it obfuscates the Quran and derails it. And it is almost never the Prophet offering up the information. He has to be asked, again showing that he did not see it as his job, nor did he ever see himself as the Quran's interpreter. Point 5. The majority of tafsir is actually from other than the Prophet and is equally a barrier to the Quran. The tafsir books that rely on the Sunnah and narrations provide explanations which take away its urgency, make it ridiculous, portrays the verses in question as addressing only a small group of people, insist that verses that blame don't apply to Muslims at all, etc., etc. Or the tafsirs even say that the verses are abrogated and cancelled out, either by the Sunnah or other verses, and so the very ontology of the Quran is attacked. Point 6. We are the ones called upon directly by God to learn from and interpret the Quran. It is for us to interpret, not the Prophet. It is for us to be reminded and admonished, and it has been made easy except for a locked of heart. Point 7. From the hadiths themselves, especially the Prophet's mass-transmitted parting advice when he told his ummah that he was soon going to die, he did not say anything like, hold on to my sunnah because you needed to interpret the Quran, or because my sunnah has the real power. Nothing like that. He did not even mention his sunnah. He emphasized the Quran, and that it was enough and heavier and greater of the two things he was leaving behind to hold on to for guidance. The other of which was his itrah from his Ahlul Bayt, and them only because God informed him that they would stick with the Quran. It all comes back to the Quran, to God's own words, to God's own book, which he authored. And why would it not, for God's sake? Why would it be any other way? And the last point, point 8, for those critical and who are unconsumed by Ahlul Hadith, just follow the line of forgeries. First, forgeries regarding the Quran and Sunnah. Then came forgeries regarding following the Sunnah of the first two Caliphs, without mentioning the Quran. Then forgeries regarding following the Sunnahs of all righteous Caliphs, right, and clenching onto them with one's molar teeth, again without mentioning the Quran. You never find a mention about holding onto the Quran with one's molar teeth in any of those narrations. Okay, and then forgeries which add complete fierce obedience to the rulers and being like a docile camel, now in contradiction to the Quran. And then attempts to promote the caliphs as being better than prophets and messengers, and as God's shadow on earth, and chosen by God. Okay? All of that should show you a clear direction, like I said before, a clear path and movement, a push away from the Quran towards the rulers. Literally hijrah from the Quran and pushed by the intellectual criminals. The mujrimeen, and the concept of Sunnah is at the heart of it. Okay, used to funnel you away from the Quran and towards the rulers. Isn't it obvious the excellent utility that rulers and their supporters among the scholars and narrators would see in dogmas regarding the Sunnah and its being more powerful than the Quran, and a ruler and interpreter over the Quran? Isn't that obvious? Because the Sunnah is up for grabs, and each caliph had a Sunnah. But the Quran is not up for grabs and has no utility for the caliphs, unless they make it so that the concept of Sunnah is something that rules over and interprets the Quran for them. And with that one concept, the Quran can be sidelined or made to follow the Sunnah by those in whose heart is a disease. Okay, and let me repeat again, this clear movement and push away from the Quran is the work of the enemies of prophethood. Okay, learn these two verses, okay, and the one which is linked to them. Let me say them again. وقال الرسول يا رب إن قوم اتخذوا هذا القرآن مهجورا وكذلك جعلنا لكل نبي عدوا من المجرمين وكفى بربك هاديا ونصيرا. And the messenger will say, My Lord, my people abandoned this Qur'an. And thus have we made for every prophet enemies among criminals. And enough is your Lord as a guide and helper. And the verse which goes with it, which shows how these enemies of prophethood do this, they do it through embellished words. Like the Sunnah is hermeneutically more powerful than the Quran. They do it with those hadiths. وكذلك جعلنا لكل نبي عدوا شياطين الإنس والجن يوحي بعضهم إلى بعض زخرف القول غرورا. And thus have we made for every prophet enemies, shaitans of men and jinn, inspiring in one another embellished words of deceit. Okay, and these are the things which will take you away from the Quran. Right? وقال الرسول يا رب إن قوم اتخذوا هذا القرآن مهجورا. Right? وكذلك جعلنا لكل نبي عدوا. Okay, they are linked. These verses are linked. But what's the actual Quranic guidance against all of that? Against this work of the shayateen, enemies of prophethood, both human and jinn. And what's the perspective we are supposed to have? Well, the verse and the surah continues. وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ مَا فَعَلُوهُ فَذَرْهُمْ وَمَا يَفْتَرُونَ. And if your Lord had willed, they would not have done so. So let them be, both them and that which they invent. Okay, do you hear that? That which they forge, leave it. The Prophet is commanded to let it be. Okay, all of these corruptions and forgeries, the Prophet is actually commanded to let it be. Why? People who come to see just how deep the problems of our inherited Islam are sometimes ask, why did God allow this to happen? Right? Why didn't He protect His religion? Some people get depressed and despondent or start to doubt, thinking if this revelation was truly from God, all of this corruption would not have happened. Well, listen to why. Just listen. Because even these forgeries have a use for God's purpose in this world, no matter how much we hate them. Okay, the next verse continues. وَلِتَصْغَى إِلَيْهِ أَفْئِدَةُ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ وَلِيَرْضَوْهُ وَلِيَقْتَرِفُوا مَا هُمْ مُقْتَرِفُونَ. Okay, why is this allowed to happen? Why is the Prophet told to leave the forgeries and those who make them, just let them be? It's so that the minds of those who have no faith in the hereafter may listen to it and be inclined to it, and so that they may be pleased with it and then earn what they are wont to earn, what they would earn. So it is allowed to be so that like can find like, so that birds of a feather may flock together, so that those who hate accountability before God, before justice in the hereafter, may freely listen to it and fill their minds with it, and then be pleased with it, and thus proceed to show their true colors through what they earn. Okay, that's why it's allowed. So that they may take of the rope extended by those shayateen who were and are enemies to prophethood, and have enough of that rope to hang themselves with, basically. Just as the muttaqeen, the people of virtue, may take hold of the rope of God, the Qur'an. Right? كتاب الله حبل ممدود من السماء إلى الأرض طرف بيد الله عز وجل وطرف بأيديكم. The book of Allah, God's rope extended from the sky down to the earth. One end in God's hand, the other end in your hands. Both ropes have to continue throughout the ages. It isn't just those living at the time of the Prophet that have to choose between divine words brought by those prophets and the embellished words of deceit brought by their enemies. That wouldn't be fair. We have to choose too. We have to distinguish as well. So what will you choose? The Quran or the Sunnah? Right? That the Quran is more powerful than the Sunnah, or that the Sunnah is more powerful than the Quran? What will your mind listen to? Okay, I really need to stop this there. That last part was just supposed to be a summary of the 8 points, but I got carried away, and this video is already far too long. So we'll continue in the next video. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.